Let's look at environmental and foreign policy issues that somewhat divide the nation from about 1980 to around 2010. First off, let's look at environmental issues. Conflicts in the Middle East involving the United States and not involving the United States, as well as concerns about climate change, lead to debates in the United States over our society's dependence on fossil fuels like oil and gasoline, and the impact of economic consumption on the environment. Now, during the 1980s, when President Reagan is in office, Reagan appoints department heads in the executive branch who are opposed to some of the government departments that they're put in charge of. For example, James Watt is appointed Secretary of the Interior. That means he's in charge of all public lands. James Watt is an anti-environmentalist. He once called environmentalism a left-wing cult. James Watt opened millions of acres of land to businesses, oil and coal companies, large-scale ranchers, and timber companies. These public lands are sold off under James Watt's time as Secretary of the Interior. Also, Ann Gorsuch Burford is put in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency. She had disparaged environmentalists as well, and when she gets into the EPA, she cuts the EPA's budget by 22%. Remember, Reagan, new federalism, and decreasing the size of the federal government is a goal. Ann Gorsuch Burford also reduced the number of cases that the EPA filed against polluters. The EPA relaxed Clean Air Act regulations that they were enforcing prior to her time in that agency. She facilitated the spraying of some restricted use pesticides without those ranches and farming corporations being prosecuted or getting in any trouble for that. And she is, in fact, the first agency director in U.S. history to be cited for contempt of Congress. Congress approved a large sum of money to clean up toxic waste areas, and Burford basically refused to do so and was cited by Congress for contempt. So the environment was controversial before we got into a war in 1990 that really focused on or had as one of its core causes oil. And that is the first Gulf War. It spanned from 1990 to 1991. Now, President Reagan had supported this man, Saddam Hussein, who was the leader of Iraq. And during the 1980s, Iraq was at war with their neighbor, Iran. And the United States did not have good relations with Iran. Iraq fought Iran, and President Reagan supported Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis in part to maintain supplies of Iraqi oil being sold to the United States and our allies. After Reagan leaves office, George H.W. Bush takes over, and Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, partially as revenge for Kuwait selling more oil than OPEC had agreed. That caused the price of oil to rise, and that hurt other oil-selling countries like Iraq. And it's also partially to capture the valuable and rich Kuwaiti oil fields found in that little small country right there on the Persian Gulf. The United States quickly moves to defend our ally in the region, Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia is very important because they control or sit on top of 20% of the world's oil supply. The United States moves in for what is called Operation Desert Shield. Eventually, those troops you see there stationed along the border press into Iraq, liberate Kuwait, and it is a very swift victory for the United States and our coalition forces. We weren't fighting Iraq alone. But to avoid a protracted engagement in Iraq, Saddam Hussein is left in power. Sanctions are imposed against Iraq. And as they're leaving Kuwait, the Iraqi forces under Saddam Hussein's orders light a lot of the oil wells on fire. And that's what you see there in the background. Now, after the first Gulf War and still today, the United States had a reluctance to be a world leader on environmental issues. Maybe the best example of this happened in 2005 with what was called the Kyoto Protocol. This was an international treaty spearheaded by the UN on climate change. And now it was signed by 84 nations, most of them agreeing to limit the carbon emissions that their nation produced, the things that were causing climate change. But it was not signed by the United States. And that is mainly due to work done by oil and coal lobbyists pressuring our government. That's a result of free market capitalists arguing that these kinds of business restrictions are not needed. And it's also a result of some conservatives, some in the government, who just wholly denied that climate change was taking place, despite scientific evidence otherwise. In addition, cap and trade legislation, which might seek to, or might have the effect of lowering carbon emissions, and taxes placed on carbon emissions, or taxes placed on businesses that have carbon emissions. Neither of these have been supported by the U.S. Congress. Let's move on to foreign policy. Now, despite some of the economic challenges and despite some of the foreign policy challenges that the United States faced in the post-Cold War era, the United States continued to act as one of the world's leading superpowers in the 21st century. And I say one of because in the modern world, since the Cold War, there are emerging economic challengers. There are emerging political challengers. Heck, even emerging military challengers to U.S. dominance. Now, some of that comes from cooperatization or other nations coming together, like we see in 1992 with the formation of the European Union. This is a global economic and political force today. Now, Great Britain recently voted to leave the Economic Union, but the Economic Union and its currency, the euro, are still very powerful parts of our global economy and society. China is a emerging, or maybe already emerged, global economic and political force. And a lot of that is from the amazing growth that their nation has recently experienced. From the years 2000 to 2008, their gross domestic product, the value of all of their products added up, quadrupled. Now, this is better growth than that legendary economic boom in the United States that took place in the 1950s and 1960s. And it's important to remember that a lot of those exports, a majority probably of those Chinese exports, are going to the United States. And that has an added effect of really decreasing U.S. manufacturing, as Chinese factories can produce goods for cheaper prices than most American factories. More and more Americans are buying goods produced in China, and that results in fewer of those manufacturing jobs staying viable, staying good-paying jobs here in the United States. India in Southern Asia and Brazil in South America are not yet maybe at world power status economically, but they are certainly regional powers. Brazil dominates trade in South America. India really has far-reaching trade around the Indian Ocean. And so today we might call our world a multipolar world. You still have the United States as one of the superpowers, but Europe working together, India, China, Brazil, Russia's even on there. We didn't talk about them. And all of these superpowers have a lot of their attention focused on the Middle East and the effects of globalization, which we'll talk about first. So, the battle over globalization, or the debate over globalization, can really be seen in 1999 in what is sometimes dubbed the Battle for Seattle. In 1999, the World Trade Organization held a summit, a big meeting of 15 of the strongest economic countries in the world. And they came together to talk about various issues surrounding global trade. This summit is met with protesters. And some of those protesters even got destructive and started destroying chain stores like McDonald's and Starbucks. Many of the protesters were calling for global trade and investment to be used to achieve equitable and sustainable development. This is really calling attention to who is benefiting from globalization. Is it all nations, or is it the powerful, prosperous nations? This call to action was really led by a human rights organization known as Global Exchange, and they're being very critical of the World Trade Organization and the free trade that the World Trade Organization is advocating. They are pointing out that workers around the globe are exploited for their labor, that working conditions vary greatly, and some workers have to work in very dangerous conditions. Pay is not equitable around the world, and other issues surrounding global trade. Speaking of globalization, economic crises in one part of the world, including the United States, like the Great Recession of 2008, become global events. So when the United States economy really falters in 2008, with the foreclosures of a large number of homes and home sales dropping, the effects are felt around the world. Let's look next at the Middle East. Another emerging trend in the modern world, in the post-Cold War era, is a deeper involvement by the United States in the Middle East. And in the Middle East, you have the United States and Western allies, let's call them, really advocating, really pushing for, really supporting, or even symbolizing economic and even cultural globalization. Think about a McDonald's in every country in the world. And this is coming up against some people in the Middle East with very anti-Western feelings, with very pro-Arab feelings and feeling like those are mutually exclusive, and very pro-Muslim and regionalism feelings, and feeling like those cannot exist alongside the economic and cultural globalization that seems to be sweeping across the world. So why the anti-Western feelings? Why these feelings of opposition against the United States and some of our allies? Well, this dates back to before World War II. As you can see on this map, the Middle East was colonies of European powers, and very exploitive imperialism practiced by the British and the French and a few others throughout the Middle East. In addition, the United States helped to overthrow the democratic government in Iran that was elected by the people in the 1950s. But the United States CIA, helped overthrow that government and put the Shah, or the king of Iran, back into power, mainly because he was not a communist. He was essentially on our side in the Cold War and continued to sell us oil. The support for Israel that has been characteristic of the United States since Israel's creation, almost right after World War II. The United States is the first country to recognize Israel. And the United States supported Israel in the 6 Days War in 1967, and the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and then throughout the 1980s in their conflict with Lebanon and the Palestinians. U.S. support for Israel angers many Arab people in the Middle East, because the Palestinians, the Arabs living in that space, were pushed aside for the Israelis, for the Jewish people, to make a homeland where they could be safe. And many Arabs in the region take offense to that action that was done to people of their ethnicity. In addition, there is concern that U.S. presence in Saudi Arabia, one of the regional superpowers in the Middle East, that U.S. presence across the Middle East, every one of these stars is an American military base in what we might call the Middle East or Southeastern Asia. To some, this looks like a new version of colonization. Also, sanctions against the nation of Iraq right after the first Gulf War really hurt the people of Iraq. And it's events like these in the past that have led to some of the anti-American, anti-Western feelings in the region.